Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on books, gear, trails, festivals, events, fitness, health, and more. This podcast is number 59, and it's going live on August the 28th. Can't really say there's been a lot of interesting things to share this week. If I was to put my highlights on social media, the video would be banned for being too short. And I don't want to dwell on car repairs. So let's just take a look at August the 28th instead. It's Red Wine Day, Bow Tie Day, and I was about to say that I don't have one, but then realised that I do. And it's Crackers Over the Keyboard Day, which I assume is not Christmas crackers, because it's in August. It's Read Comics in Public Day. It's Power Rangers Day. It's Radio Commercials Day. When I was on the radio, that was your chance to nip to the toilet and hope that you made it back before the last one ended. Today is the day in history when lots of things happen to people whose names I can't pronounce. It's the day in 1845 that Scientific American was first published, and it's the day in 1898 a catchily named product called Brad's Drink was renamed to Pepsi-Cola. And if it's your birthday, you share it with former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, the poet John Betjeman, and American ornithologist Roger Tory Peterson. I expect most US homes have one of his bird books. I know I had several when I lived there and in Canada. I maybe still have it. I tried to identify a bird a few weeks ago and it looked nothing like any of the images in the book. And no, I wasn't looking at the US book in the UK. I do have some UK ones as well. Last time on the podcast we had a conversation about the Dorking Walking Festival. This week we're talking about, among other things, national parks and monuments in the US and asking, are they under threat of development by losing their protection to be opened up for other purposes? And that's a conversation with author and traveller Walter G Meyer. Before we get going, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover, or comments, or you want to advertise, please do get in touch at walkingpost.com, or you can just email me directly at jim@walkingpost.com. And so to this week's interview, we have a conversation with author and traveller Walter G Meyer, who we caught up with while he is on a trip in Colombia. Meyer has worked in a couple of national parks where he taught about the parks and led hikes, and he's visited 43 of the country's 63 national parks, plus more than 100 of the other sites administered by the NPS, as well as visiting dozens of national monuments, national forests and other natural areas. So I think that makes him pretty qualified to talk about the subject. Our conversation covers the US government's potential removal of protection for some national monuments, which could mean an end to hiking or public use of any kind, as companies may be given permission for mining or oil exploration on the land. Hi Walter, great to talk with you today. Maybe you could just give us a brief introduction to yourself.
My name is Walter Meyer. I am a writer and have been for many years. I've written 8 published books. I wrote a screenplay that's produced all over a stage play that's produced all over the United States. I've written articles for newspapers and magazines, often on environmental topics, but not always. And I'm a traveler. I'm currently in Bucaramanga, Colombia, just visiting a friend here and seeing more of Colombia. I was in Peru for a couple of months before this. I am a traveler. I have been to all 50 of the United States. I've been to 43 of our 63 national parks in the United States. I've been going to national parks for over 4 decades now, and I've worked in 2 of them, Denali in Alaska and Grand Teton in Wyoming. And yes, for those of you wondering, it is and always has been Denali and never should have been the other name. And I enjoy natural places. I was on a hike here yesterday with my friend here near Bucaramanga. I enjoy exploring both cities and natural places wherever I am.
I don't really know a lot about Colombia, I guess being from the UK and having spent most of my life in North America, Colombia to me is soccer and a little bit of baseball. So, what's it like for hiking?
I would correct that. It is soccer and then soccer and then soccer and then maybe a little bit of baseball. It is really, or football, of course, as they call it here. It is a passion. My friend plays at a local league, so I went to his game last night. It's always going on somewhere, somehow. Every bar, every restaurant has a television on with the football game on for the day. One thing I am learning so much here because our world is so Europe, North America centric that I didn't realize how massive these countries are. You know, on a map, they look so tiny, but you could drive. I mean, part of it's the bad roads, but also the size of the country. You could drive for 25 hours and still be in Colombia. I mean, it's a very large country and very diverse. I learned, for instance, once I was here, that by some arguments, the deepest and largest canyon in the world, but I guess it depends how you're measuring, where you're measuring from, is here. I went to it, Chicamocha. It is up there with the Grand Canyon in terms of grandeur and depth and scope and scale. I had never heard of Chicamocha. There are these beautiful little mountain towns dotting the hillside that haven't changed much since the Spanish built them in the 1600s. It's a much more diverse country than I would have thought. And spending time in Peru, all we ever learned about as far as ancient cultures there was the Inca and Machu Picchu. But I went to the town of Caral, which is the oldest town in the Americas. It was built over 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years before the Incas showed up. And they've had pyramids and all of this infrastructure. And so there are many things like that. Unfortunately, of course, when the Spanish got here, disease and other things wiped out most of the people. But one of the places I went to here in Colombia was Guane, which is the name of an ancient culture here that, again, had amazing technology for 5,000 years ago. So it's a much more diverse country than I would have thought and has a very rich history.
And I guess beyond the human history, I would imagine that the flora and fauna are very different too.
Yes. I'm surprised how many animals somehow made it from South America, North America, or vice versa. But yes, I've seen some very strange birds here and some other interesting animals here. And of course, they have llamas and alpacas and other things like there are wild guinea pigs here, which, in the United States, they're just domesticated pets, but also people grow them on their farms as food. It's a rather expensive meal in a local restaurant to order guinea pig, and there's not much meat on the bone, from what I understand. I was a little grossed out by the concept because I didn't think to eat one. But yeah, it's a meal here. San Gil, which is a few hours south of here where I was, the big local snack is ants. You can buy little containers of ants and snack on them like you would peanuts.
Is there much of an infrastructure for hiking? I mean, are there lots of marked trails and that kind of thing?
Yes and no. I mean, there are trails, but they're not like you would see in a national park in the United States. There are wilder places. A few of the hikes I have been on were like skirting people's farms. You're walking next to a barbed wire fence half the time, or you have cows coming up to you because you're actually on someone's ranch or farm. But then there's wilder places, to go up into the mountains, which I'm doing on Sunday, they have a special kind of mountain lake here that exists only in the Andean highlands, which has its own plant and animal ecosystem around these lakes. So I'm curious to see that. And that looks, from the pictures and what I've heard from people who have been there, is very isolated and rugged.
So when you go to these places, do you write about them? Do you take photos? Or is it just for the heck of it?
Well, I enjoyed the moment and the heck of it, but I also, yes, I do take a lot of photos and then write about them for my own enjoyment. But then, as I said, I just created my own YouTube channel, Walt's Wanderings, which is everything from places I have been, people I have met. I did one a few weeks ago. On my last trip to Europe, I discovered that an ancestor of mine created the Statue of Liberty, which just blew me away that no one had ever mentioned this. So I did a whole, actually 3-part of my Walt's Wanderings episodes about discovering that about the Statue of Liberty, and then learning all about the Statue of Liberty and the importance it's played in, America and the world as a symbol of freedom and liberty. And that was kind of amazing. So I did that episode, and I'm working on one now about a book that I'm working on about an American conservationist who nobody knows anything about. So I wanted to go ahead and do a Walt's Wandering episode about Margaret Murray, who I think should be up there with John Muir in terms of people who did so much to save wildlands in the United States. When she was up in her 70s, the Alaska pipeline was being built, and she was thinking she was over her, crusading conservationist days. But then President Jimmy Carter called a conference at the White House with a bunch of environmentalists and do-gooders, people like John Denver, and said, what can we do to make sure that Alaska does not become just a vast oil field, with this pipeline being built? And who could we send to Alaska? And everybody went, Margaret Murray. And so up in her 70s, she got in a small plane with a pilot, although she hated flying, and flew around Alaska for months, marking up maps of land she said should be saved. And then she went and argued those maps through Congress. And thanks largely to her efforts, obviously other people did stuff, but she created 7 new national parks in Alaska. There are now 8, tripled the size of Denali, and saved an area of Alaska larger than the state of California. And yet no one's ever heard of her or given her her due for all that she did to save wild spaces.
Speaking of wild spaces, that narrative, I guess, going way, way back, has it always been built towards improving these all the time, or has there been kind of an up and down where it's been under threat and then it's good again and then it's under threat? Is it constantly changing?
It is constantly changing. It's constantly been a seesaw. And we've gone through some really good periods of people like President Theodore Roosevelt, who did so much to save so many wild spaces when he was president, really pushed things forward. Although he was no longer president when the National Park Service and National Forest Service were created, you can draw a pretty straight line from all the work he did to those things happening. There's always been a conflict, even within the national parks, of are they here to be saved, or are they here for the tourists, for people to visit? And Margaret Murray's argument in Alaska was, we have enough places where visitors can go and tourists can take pictures. There's a number of national parks in Alaska that have no access whatsoever unless you fly in or hike in. I went to Gates of the Arctic National Park, which is the least visited national park there is. You have to hike 5 miles from the nearest road just to get to the park. And once you're there, there is nothing. It's wilderness. There is no restroom. There isn't. The visitor center is 200 miles south. Even the visitor center doesn't want to be in the park. And it's just space. And her thing was, we've got enough places that, people could be. We need places that wild things can be. And so that's always been a conflict. At times, people have wanted to drill here or mine there or, change this whole thing. Oh, we need more motels in Yosemite. Things like that, which most of the parks now, the hotel has been grandfathered in, but if it weren't already there, they would never have permitted another hotel or another restaurant in most of the national parks, saying, no, we should just leave what we have here alone. So yeah, it's always been a conflict, sometimes worse than others. The Murray family had been fighting the Alaska Wildlife Refuge since 1956. They first proposed setting aside this chunk of land. And then just recently, again, this administration proposed opening it to oil drilling again. But that oil drilling argument with the wildlife refuge has gone on since 1956.
How does that resolve, or does it not? Does it just keep going backwards and forwards?
It pretty much keeps going backwards and forwards. People along the way try to do things to protect these areas more than they have been. But I find it interesting that when this administration opened the Arctic Wildlife Refuge to drilling contracts, no one bid. The oil companies are kind of tired of this, back and forth. And are you going to spend $10 million or whatever to investigate where you should be drilling there when the next administration or the next Congress might go, no, you're not drilling here. What are you thinking? And they can't be bothered anymore. There's a number of mines in Alaska. Alaska has a ton of resources. And when I was there, there was a controversy over the Pebble Mine, as it was called, where they could get a lot of the rare earth metals that we use in cell phones. And people were like, we shouldn't be so dependent on other countries for these things. We should be doing our own. And the Alaskans, who are an interesting dichotomy in themselves, most of them are like hunters and Republicans, but also into saving their beautiful state. And they're like, no, you're not coming to our state to rip out our resources. Leave these places alone. So it's an interesting contrast between what we're trying to save and the resources that are, sitting under our feet. But I like the attitude of, well, you can get your magnesium or whatever it is someplace else. You don't have to come and rip up this pristine wilderness to do that. Or maybe we should be making cell phones with something not quite so rare.
Is that something that's more important in some places than others? Like, is Alaska under more threat than, say, Arizona or California?
I would say because Alaska does have so many resources, obviously a lot of oil. I was amazed when I was there. I learned how carefully and cleanly they did the pipeline. It's an amazing marvel of engineering to make sure that they don't have oil spills and they don't have problems. But then, yes, other areas now, under threat in southern Utah are Bears Ears National Monument and the Escalante Staircase National Monument, because somebody thinks there's rare minerals under that. But again, I wonder what company is going to spend millions of dollars starting a mine there, knowing how outraged everyone is over that, and plus the PR fallout from that. People have enough reason to dislike oil companies. Exxon does not want to be the ones going, yeah, we're the ones ripping up the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, blame us. So there is some accountability to the public for certain things, not often, but it does happen. So I think that might help protect some of these areas. But in terms of what is being done to protect, one thing that the Biden administration did was give joint title, so to speak, put their names on the title for several Indian tribes in the area, thinking that that would add a layer of protection to Bears Ears and Escalante, saying, this is now tribal land, which does have, more protection under the law in many instances. But what they are finding out with the current administration is they don't much care about the law. So they're still wanting to bulldoze over this. And the tribes are filing, lawsuits and trying to set up, barriers. I think it was a smart move to try to include them in this, because often federal lands can be bulldozed faster than tribal lands can. But still, there's a bumper sticker that I saw on the Indian reservations in the Dakotas, and I've seen in Arizona, that says, of course you can trust your government. Just ask any Indian. And so they have kind of a history of getting, how can I put this politely, screwed over by the U.S. government. So it wouldn't be the first time, but they are fighting it. Obviously, other groups, the National Resources Defense Council and League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, all those groups are fighting this as well. And with some of this stuff, all we can hope is that they will file enough lawsuits, and the Indian tribes will file enough lawsuits, that it'll run out the clock on this administration. And whoever comes in next will go, no, you can't, don't even think about it. And I'm hoping that also the governor of Utah was in favor of this. The senator from Utah was in favor of this, but no one else in Utah is. Again, like the Alaskans, they tend to be, conservative voters, supporters of the Republican Party and things like that, but they still value their beautiful land more than mineral reserves. And they're like, no, there's a huge opposition in Utah to this. So it could happen that the governor and the senator get voted out because of their support for ruining parts of Utah. I don't know how much time you spent in Utah, but they are famous for having the closest cluster of national parks, the Big Five as they're called. There are some amazing lands in Utah. And I have said, driving around like Moab, Utah, you could pick like any 40 square mile area and go, that's a beautiful national park. That's, it's like most of southern Utah, you could just draw into national parks because it's all spectacular. Escalante certainly could be, Bears Ears could be. So I hope that we get some people in who will try to protect these areas rather than just look for minerals.
Is the opposition to it just in areas where they have the parks, or does it include, like people in Chicago? Are they outraged about what's happening to the national parks, or is it, well, it's not in my backyard, so I don't care?
It depends. I mean, obviously, a lot of people in Chicago are going about their lives, but the people in Chicago who value the national parks and travel to them care. And there's another problem that's going on in our national parks is that they have really cut back on the number of rangers they have. They've really cut back on the services they've had. They've really kind of messed up the national parks. And I talked to some park rangers who, can't say this officially, but they actually think that this is deliberate to so screw up the national parks. Like, it's full of garbage anyway, and it's a mess, and it's just a traffic jam. We should go ahead and drill for oil in Yosemite. that it really is a deliberate attempt to so ruin the parks that they are not the valuable asset they once were. And then nobody will care if they become an oil field. So yes, there is outrage about that all over the place. And when I went to Yosemite this past spring, just a one-day trip, I was cat sitting for my cousin in Sacramento, and I took a day trip to Yosemite. It was already a nightmare. The traffic was horrible. There was trash because no one was picking it up. I heard the shuttle bus driver I was on swearing at our dispatcher about how bad things were. Like, I can't take this anymore. And if it's that bad in April, I'm thinking, what is it going to be like in August? But obviously, everybody on that bus and the other people I encountered in the park were there from Chicago or Kansas or Alabama or whatever, who came to enjoy the beauty that is Yosemite. And it's hard to enjoy it when you couldn't find a parking place because the traffic was bumper to bumper. And I couldn't do most of the hikes I wanted to do because I couldn't even get a shuttle bus to the trailhead, let alone drive to the trailhead because the traffic was already so bad.
Is there also, you talk about things like minerals and oil, is there also the potential for land being taken away for settlements and for expansion of, housing?
Much less of that, because most of the national parks are far enough away from big cities that the chances of them getting encroached upon by housing developments, whatever, are small. But as I said, for years, it's been, sacred space that you don't build more hotels there, you don't build, but that could happen where they build a resort in a national park. There's been talk of that. This administration is big on that as well, building resorts. So I could see that happening more than a housing development, but a big resort being built in, some of these places that have for so long been set aside to not have those things. I found it interesting in the research I'm doing about the Murray family, who, as I said, Margaret Murray helped create so many of the national parks in Alaska, but she and her husband Olas moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming before Grand Teton National Park was there. And within 2 years, the park was created. They were on the right side of that one, but it was getting developed. And John Rockefeller Jr. decided it shouldn't be. And he started buying up land to make sure that it never got developed. And I thought that was, an amazing contribution for a really wealthy person. And if I were Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, I would rather have a big chunk of Grand Teton National Park named after me, as John D. Rockefeller Jr. does, than have another zero in my bank account. That to me would mean a lot more, to be able to take my grandkids down this road and go, see this? I did this. I saved all this. And I think that's an important thing. But there was a fight over Grand Teton. There were ranchers in the valley who did not want to move. They did not want a prohibition on hunting predators, wolves and bears in particular. They had a lot of things they did not like about this. And the governor of Wyoming fiercely opposed putting this park there and what it would do to the ranching and things like that. And there is, in the visitor center there, reproduced part of a letter that he eventually wrote saying, "I'm sorry I ever opposed this. This is the best thing that ever happened to Wyoming." So when people realize the benefits, one more little area to graze cattle versus preserving this incredibly beautiful, pristine spot, there's lots of places you can graze cattle. There isn't another set of Tetons anywhere on Earth. And that's the priority that Alaskans and Utahns are given to their wild spaces now, is we can drill for oil and we can look for minerals somewhere else, but where can you ever recreate this? It's taken a while to clean up some of the national parks that had gone the wrong direction, including Yellowstone. If you look at pictures from the late 1800s, it's a mess. But they took down most of the buildings. They really restricted tourist activity. They certainly don't let you walk through a mud pot anymore, which there's pictures of people playing in bubbling mud pots. And it's saved the space for all of us to enjoy the way it was when it was found hundreds of years ago, found by white people, I should say. Obviously, the indigenous people knew about it long before that. So I think we have an obligation to not only ourselves to be able to go to Grand Teton or Yellowstone or Yosemite and enjoy what it is, but a bigger obligation to the people who come after us, that in 100 years, people will be able to go to Yellowstone and still see the natural beauty and not have a shopping mall there.
Every once in a while, I see a story or an article that I put in the news about friends of and different trusts buying up land for preservation. Is there much of that? I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk. He could probably buy 3 states and turn it over to conservation.
There is some of that still, not enough, obviously, but there is some of that still. And as I mentioned, when millionaires used to do stuff for national parks, the first director of the National Park Service was a guy named Stephen Mather, who made millions in California borax in what is now Death Valley National Park. But he used to write letters to the director of the Interior and other friends he had in Washington going, your national parks are pretty bad. You really need to do something about this. And finally, the Secretary of the Interior said, Stephen, think you do a better job? You can be director of the National Park Service. And so he became the first director. And he had times when he saw wait, it would be so much better if we had a road over here. And they'd be like, well, that's not part of the national park. He's like, fine, I'll buy that land, give it to the national park, and then we can put the road over there. So he would encourage his rich friends to buy and donate land. He would buy and donate land. So there has been that, history over time, and there still is some of that now where coalitions will come together and try to preserve another chunk of land. But obviously, the amount of money that the Wilderness Society has versus the amount of money that Elon Musk has are not exactly equal. And yes, if he wanted to buy and build a data center, right outside the gates of Yosemite, he has a lot more money to do that than the Wilderness Society has to buy that land and try to set it aside so that can't happen. But yes, it still goes on, but on a much smaller scale than the days when the robber barons used to actually help us out instead of the other way around. Ted Turner started buying huge tracts of land and not giving them the Park Service. He's keeping them, but keeping them wild. And you can go, and this is kind of like setting aside a national park for rich people, but you could go and spend a week or a month or whatever in one of these kind of private parks and have it pretty much to yourself, because not a lot of people can afford to do that. So I do have a little bit of an issue with that. Like, it's a national park only for people who can afford to pay thousands of dollars to go there. But on the other hand, there are so few people going there that the wildlife can thrive because there aren't a lot of tourists, and it's being left in a pretty much natural state where the bison can roam and the deer and the antelope can play. So it's like, is it necessarily a bad thing that we have private game reserves? But you mentioned being in the UK, that's how it used to be, where the king and the duke owned all these private game reserves. They could hunt their deer and stags there, but the common people couldn't. So I guess Ted Turner's argument is, well, anybody can go to Yosemite. Only certain people can go here, and that preserves this even better than the traffic jams in Yosemite.
And you hope that over generations that gets turned over anyway to either the national parks or to the people of the states or whatever.
Perhaps, maybe that is the long-term goal here. But I like the idea that Wallace Stegner called the national parks America's best idea. And it has been copied in so many other countries. I was amazed to find out, for instance, Colombia, we have 63 national parks in the United States. Colombia, a much smaller country, has 58 national parks. And that more and more countries, set aside more and more land. And certainly in the UK, a lot of land that used to belong to the prince or the duke or whatever have become national parks. And it's our land. And that's one of the things that bothers me about what's going on with the boundary waters in Michigan or Bears Ears or some of these other places under threat, is that we own them. It should not be up to any one individual who decides what happens to them. If you and I and a bunch of other people are sharing a house and we decide to chip in and buy a big TV, when you move out, you don't get to take the TV or you don't get to break the TV. That's joint property of everybody in the house. And you could ask our permission to do something with the TV, or, if you break it, it should be your responsibility to fix it. But taking the TV when you move out is theft. And stealing natural resources that belong to the entire United States, the people of the United States, not the government, the people of the United States, is theft. And we have a right and an obligation to demand that you leave our TV alone. It's not yours to take. And one thing I learned in my researching about the Statue of Liberty that I didn't know before I went, there's a museum in Colmar, France, dedicated to Auguste Bertholdi, the guy who built the Statue of Liberty, whose grandmother was from my family. He could not get the French government to pay for the statue. So he took up a collection among the French people to pay for the statue. And they did. And then when it came time to build the plinth, the base for it in New York Harbor, some wealthy people, including Andrew Carnegie and Joseph Pulitzer, offered to pay for it. And he goes, no, if the people of France paid for the statue, the people of the United States should pay for the base. And they did. So it was a gift from the people of France to the people of the United States, not a gift from the government of France to the government of the United States. And I like that concept. We often think the government and the people are interchangeable, but they're not. As I said, in Utah right now, the government of the state of Utah is like, yeah, let's drill, let's mine. And the people of the state of Utah are like, no, not on our land. It is our land. Leave it alone.
One of the big things with that is that once you start doing those things, reversing it becomes extremely difficult.
How many years, as I said, I mean, and they weren't even like drilling in Yellowstone, but how many years did it take to turn Yellowstone's clock back to where it was in a much better natural state than it was? And so, yes, if you were to mine, if you were to drill, how many decades, how many generations would it take to get it back anywhere near that? And there are certain things that cannot be replaced. I was talking to a friend of mine who's worked in Glacier National Park and is big environmentalist guy, and he said, in that part of Utah, rarely rains, it is a desert, there is a thin layer of dirt that develops that helps seal in the moisture. So whatever water comes stays and nourishes the plants and the animals and things there. When they did some uranium mining in part of Utah in the 1950s and 60s, it destroyed that top layer, and you could still see the tire tracks from trucks from the 1950s. And that destroys that top layer, which means it will take how many hundreds, thousands of years for that soil to be able to do its job, nurturing the plants and animals that are there. And all you're going to get is a little puddle in one spot instead of it spreading out the way it should to nourish everything. I led hikes in Denali National Park. When I would get a group of people, I would say to them, how many of you have ever been to Phoenix, Arizona? And of course, someone had. And I'd say, and when you got off the bus here today, didn't you look around and go, boy, this looks like Phoenix? And they'd be like, no, not at all. But it gets the same rainfall as Phoenix. Phoenix, being a desert, the water lands runs off, and most of what comes to Denali is snow. Same amount of precipitation, but it takes a very slow time to settle in. But being a desert, once you destroy what's there or it gets damaged, it's going to take a long time to heal. And that's why I would say to people, please stay on the path. You step off this path, it doesn't look that bad, but you have crushed the lichen and you have crushed the other underbrush there that literally could take 100 years or more to heal. You're one boot step there. And I would point out there's a bad fire there in 1924, and you could still see fire damage that looked like it happened last week. And it's not going to heal for a very, very long time. And yes, that is a big problem in Utah. It's a big problem in Alaska. It's a big problem in lots of places, that it's not like, oh, I'll just, flip over the soil and plant some flowers here. No, it's going to take a very long time because the ecosystem has developed in such a way to provide water for the plants and animals over a long period of time.
When it comes down to the seesawing between Republican, Democrat, and things changing all the time, are you optimistic long term that the people will win and that the national parks and the land will win?
It's hard to be optimistic at times like this, I will admit, but I do like what I'm seeing in Texas. Big Bend National Park is under threat from a different reason, which is building a border wall, completely unnecessary border wall, but a border wall through Big Bend. And the vast majority of the Republican politicians in Texas are standing with the Democrats to oppose it. They're like the Alaskans and the Utahns. Again, Republicans going, no, do not mess with our land. And so that gives me hope that so many Republicans in Utah are opposing what's happening to Bears Ears. So many Republicans in Texas are opposing what's happening to Bears Ears, that I think the governors who oppose this are going to pay the price of the ballot box, because people would rather have their valuable land as is than used for other purposes. So that does give me hope. And the seesaw, has always gone back and forth in U.S. politics, sometimes amazingly so, that, somebody gets elected and I'm finding myself going, do you remember what happened last time? This isn't ancient history. Why is this? But I'm hoping when that rubber band bounces back, because it usually does, that it bounces way back. And one thing that I hope will happen is that a lot more checks and balances will be put in place. It never occurred to our founding fathers, as brilliant as they were, that anybody could want to do that. And now that someone is doing it, I think we're going to need to take steps to say we're never going to let this happen again. And these are the steps we need to do that. And I think we need to enshrine even more carefully and forcefully protection of our public spaces, whether it's the national monuments or national parks or whatever, so that any one person or any one administration cannot destroy these places, which, as I said, don't belong to you or me. They belong to the future generations, and they belong to all the American people, and we should have a say. I mean, it takes a huge deal to amend the Constitution. It should take a huge deal in a vote of the people to mine Yosemite National Park. And anybody who has been there, I think, would appreciate that. There'd be a very small percentage of the people who would look at the Grand Canyon and go, yeah, I think this could use some oil rigs. It's so breathtaking. It's so amazing that I don't know how you could visit those places and think, yeah, I'd be okay with a strip mine right here.
And we haven't even talked about climate change and how, by strip mining and by using more coal and making more oil rigs, you adversely affect the climate, and that affects the parks as well.
Very much so. And again, leading hikes in Denali, we actually would give a lecture about some aspect of the park and then go into the park to look at it. Climate change is hitting Alaska much harder than anywhere else. Well, I shouldn't say Alaska, I should say up towards the Arctic Circle. The further north you go, the worse climate change gets. The average global temperature has gone up about 2 degrees over the last, is it 50 years, 100 years? But in Alaska, it's gone up 7 degrees centigrade, which is a lot. And the reason is, as the Pacific heats up, the warm air currents carry that up over Alaska, and it's thawing faster. And then by the time it gets back down to the lower 48, it's already dissipated a little bit. And when you talk about climate change, people in Chicago go, no, it's a farce, because I mean, we get these, Arctic blasts, the Polar Express once a winter, where it's like 30 below for a week. So the planet's getting colder. And I interviewed Michael Mann, who is the Penn State climate scientist who came up with the famous hockey stick graph that shows how temperatures have gone up since the Industrial Revolution. And he said, if you want to prove how this works, open your freezer door and point a fan into the freezer. In a few moments, you will have a puddle of cold air at your feet. And you go, oh, cool, the kitchen's getting colder. This is great. But what is happening to the frozen food in your freezer while you are doing this? Yes, you're getting colder air in Chicago temporarily, but everything in the freezer is thawing. And that's what's happening in the Arctic right now. And it's creating a huge problem in that the bark beetle, for instance, is just devouring hundreds of acres of trees. They used to freeze to death over the winter, and only a few would survive, and only their larvae would emerge in the spring. But now it's enough warmer in the winter, they survive all winter. So they start devouring trees the minute they wake up. They start spreading faster. They've had some incredibly large wildfires spreading through these dead trees that didn't used to be able to happen because the bark beetles could only eat so much. But you would drive for literally 100 miles in parts of Alaska and see dead trees. And I'm not a fire expert, but you don't have to be. Look at there, that's kindling. Anything starts a fire here, there is nothing to stop it. So yes, it's a major problem in the north, but other parks as well, obviously. And yes, adding more greenhouse gases to the environment anywhere on Earth is not going to help the situation at all. And when we think about the amount of money that we spend, the US government spends subsidizing the coal industry, for instance, if we were to put a small percentage of that into, renewable sources, wind and solar and things, it would make a huge difference. And there's a great documentary about coal mining called Blood on the Mountain about West Virginia, where my brother happens to live. And I didn't realize how coal mining has shrunk so much that we're doing all this to subsidize coal mines, spending all this money. But there are fewer people employed right now in coal mines in the United States than work in Arby's restaurants. It's like, would the US government spend this kind of money to subsidize Arby's, to keep this fast food chain alive? We're doing all this to save coal mines. The political fight over that, if you say, I don't care about coal miners, don't run for re-election because you're not getting re-elected in West Virginia. That's not going to happen. So we need a mindset that says we need to adapt to what is coming. You and I were discussing the fact that we're addicted to our cell phones now and we need to hang on to them at all costs. But we had to adapt to that. We had to change and accept that technology was a good thing in our lives. And I can use my GPS to wander around Europe without getting lost, which wasn't always the case. We need to say these new technologies are coming in and we should do something about them. And certainly in Scotland, I keep hearing about new wind farms off the coast of Scotland where they are doing what they can to try to get away from the mines that once dotted northern England and Wales. And I think we need more of that. Germany, which has a heck of a lot less sun than Arizona or California, has had entire days where they have powered their entire country from solar energy. Why isn't Arizona doing that? I've been to both places. There's a lot more sun in Arizona. It would be easier to do there than it would be in Germany.
All of the reports that you read, whether it's from the National Park Service or from fitness apps and fitness companies, people in the US, the surveys are showing they want to get out more, they're hiking more, they want to be in the outdoors more. It just seems like this is something that is important to people, and yet we're ignoring that.
For the last couple of months, there's been warnings in big parts of the United States, don't go outside because of the smoke from the Canadian forest fires. And rather than sending help to help put out the Canadian fires, let's slap them with tariffs and blame them for this environmental disaster, which I don't think the Canadian government deliberately caused, just to upset the United States. It's crazy to even think that way, but obviously people do. But yes, it would be nice to be able to have air to breathe, that you don't worry about breathing in all this smoke. But wildfires are getting worse all over the world. They've had them, in Spain, they've had them in Germany, they've had them in Canada, obviously, and all over the United States. And they're going to keep happening. It's not something the Canadian government did wrong. It's just the nature of where we are right now. And as I said, we are primed for a massive fire in Alaska. There will be hundreds of square miles. So the long-term solution to this is not tariffs. The long-term solution to this is clean up the environment so the trees don't keep dying. We don't have all this tinder out there waiting to burn.
Well, first, let's hope that this never happens, because we need more, not less, land available, even if it's not for people to visit, just for nature and to help the planet. Is there a connection between increased natural disasters and the way humans have treated the planet? Well, I think the only people pushing back against that argument would be those who make lots of money from exploiting the planet. But as Walter said, it's not necessarily all gloom and doom, as lots of people are fighting this. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com. We are always looking for guests, whether it's about a new trail, a new book, walking festivals, or maybe someone you know or you have done an amazing, unusual, or interesting walk somewhere. So I hope you enjoyed this week's WalkingPost.com podcast, and I hope you have a great week ahead, hopefully with a walk somewhere, whether it's in your local neighbourhood or a national park. Until next time, happy trails! Walking Post from WalkingPost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.